Speaking to the bill, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill, I don't think, could have found a more passionate advocate for the delegate who's carrying it. He believes very strongly in this and he's clearly put a lot of time into it. However, this bill suffers from some policy problems. It also suffers from some constitutional defects. When I first got here, somebody told me in orientation that I ought to go read the Constitution of Virginia before I walk on this floor. So I went and did that. There's a lot of interesting things in it. There's actually 3 parts of our Constitution that present a real problem when it comes to this bill. First of all, Section 16 of the Constitution says, you all heard a lot about this last session due to the opinion of our Attorney General, Ken Cuccinelli. It says, nor shall the General Assembly make any like appropriation to any charitable institution which is not owned or controlled by the Commonwealth. You all remember that. We had a lot of discussion about Operation Smile and some other things. The voters of this state have said that we may not appropriate money to a charity that is not controlled by this government. The Attorney General ruled that we've been very clear about that. The Constitution is crystal clear about that. What is a tax credit? A tax credit, folks, is a dollar-for-dollar credit against the tax liability of a taxpayer. I recognize this one's 70%. I think they still get their deduction if I'm not mistaken. So this is a dollar-for-dollar reduction of general fund revenue, which would otherwise be available for public school funding. From my point of view, this is trying to do through the back door what the voters of this state have said we cannot do through the front. And that theme continues because also in Article 8, Section 10, the voters of this state in 1901 added a provision to the Constitution of Virginia due to the experience that we'd had through Reconstruction and before, where they wrote, no appropriation of public funds shall be made available to any school or institution of learning not owned or exclusively controlled by the state or some political subdivision thereof. What has the Supreme Court said about that? Well, in 1955, this body tried to create a voucher program for the children of veterans of World War II. The Supreme Court of Virginia said that was unconstitutional. Why did they say that? The record of the debates of the Constitutional Convention of 1901-02 during the framing and adoption of Section 141 shows that its dominant purpose was to aid and maintain the public free school system and to guard against any diversion of public school funds from that purpose. They went on to say that a program that diverts funds indirectly, as opposed to one that gives it outright, is also unconstitutional. The Supreme Court wrote, there's no suggestion in the debates that in the opening sentence of Section 141 was intended, as the petitioner argues, to merely prohibit direct aid to such institutions, to permit indirect aid to them. The Supreme Court in Allen v. Day ruled that a voucher program that indirectly provides funds to private schools is unconstitutional under the Constitution of Virginia. And that's one of the things that these other 8 states does not have is the Constitution of Virginia, informed by the wisdom of 2 centuries or 4 centuries, depending on how you look at it, that the voters built into what we adopted in 1901. But that provision was adopted to prevent exactly this kind of program. What else does the Constitution say? Article 1, Section 16. The General Assembly shall not make any appropriation of public funds, personal property, or real estate to any church or sectarian society or any association or institution of any kind whatever, which is entirely, partly, directly, or indirectly controlled by any church or sectarian society. What did the Supreme Court say? What has they said about that through the years? Well, in 1994, a delegate asked our Attorney General whether that prohibited a voucher program for private schools. Our Attorney General noted in an Attorney General opinion, a higher wall of church-state separation has long been recognized in Virginia. And quoting from the Supreme Court of Virginia, no state has more jealously guarded and preserved the questions of religious belief and religious worship as questions between each individual person and his maker than Virginia. Jones v. Commonwealth, 1946. So many of the milestones of religious liberty, such as Jefferson's Bill for Religious Liberties and Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, have sprung from Virginian sources, that it is not surprising if the Virginia courts see Virginia's religious guarantees as having a vitality independent from the federal Constitution. The Attorney General went on to write, the historic prominence of Virginia in the solidification of this nation's separation between church and state was saluted by Justice Hugo Black in the Everson case. This bill does not contain a limitation for only non-sectarian private schools. These scholarships can go to sectarian or non-sectarian schools. That violates the Constitution of Virginia. Beyond that, there's nothing today prohibiting any corporation, any business, or even an individual from making a contribution to one of these kinds of charities and taking a tax deduction if they so choose. The question is whether we want to turbocharge it, whether we want to make a tax credit out of this. And that's a big difference because, again, it's a dollar-for-dollar credit. We've seen a lot of tax credits today. I think we had beehives earlier today. We got coal coming up, major facility tax credits, telecommuting, ports. We've talked a lot about tax credits. I guess we're going to keep talking about them. But what this bill is, folks, is a slippery slope to doing what has been prohibited through the front door, around through the back. What this says, if we pass this, and if it's allowed, is that if the Attorney General says we can't do an appropriation to Operation Smile, the Virginia Federation of Food Banks, the Special Olympics, the Virginia Quality of Life for Rural Medical Center, the Virginia Waterfront for International Arts Festival, the Bedford Hospice Hospital, that we can just create tax credits to go around backwards and do what the Constitution says we can't do frontwards. That's what this says. So from a policy basis, on that policy basis, on that constitutional basis, this is a place we don't want to go. The last thing I'll say is, I'll have to disagree with the gentleman about this, is that I think he said in his comments justifying this that this helps poor kids. And I think built into that statement, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think built into that statement is an assumption that private schools are in some way better than public schools. And that is something that I strenuously disagree with. I went to public schools. My daddy went to public schools. My mother did. My family, my mother's family, was a family of farmers in this state for 300 years before we had a public school system. My grandfather had to leave the farm in 8th grade because there wasn't anywhere else for him to go. He had to go back cutting corn and canning tomatoes because he didn't have options, because they didn't have school past 8th grade in Franklin County where he lived at the time, because Franklin County didn't have a high school until about 1950. Virginia has had a steadfast, unswerving, strong belief in our public schools built into our Constitution, which has built one of the strongest public school systems in this country. And that's one of the reasons, that's why we need to vote against this bill, and I would encourage the body to vote no.